The morning did not feel like the beginning of a mystery. It felt like any other morning that had ever belonged to the mountains. Quiet, thin with cold, unremarkable in a way that ordinary moments always are before they become something else. The sky was clear enough to promise a good day, pale blue stretching without urgency above a ridgeline that had stood unchanged for longer than memory. Pine needles crunched softly under boots. Breath lingered in the air, visible only for a second before dissolving, as if even the cold did not want to interrupt what felt like a routine start. They had done this before. Not this exact trail, perhaps, but enough of them to know the rhythm of it. The steady climb, the way conversation naturally fades as lungs work harder, the comfort of knowing where your hands are meant to go when the path narrows. Their backpacks rested against the car while final adjustments were made. Straps tightened, water bottles checked, a jacket tied instead of worn. There was no drama in these moments, no sense of danger, just the small, familiar rituals of people who trusted both themselves and the terrain beneath their feet. Someone laughed about the cold. Someone else pointed out how quiet it was, how the season had thinned the crowds. A camera sat forgotten on the passenger seat, not out of fear or superstition, but simply because mornings are imperfect and humans are forgetful. The mountain waited without reaction. It did not loom or threaten. It simply existed, immense and patient, as it always had. The trailhead sign was weathered, its lettering softened by years of sun and snow. Distances were listed, elevation gains noted. Nothing on it suggested uncertainty. It spoke in absolutes, miles, feet, hours, as if nature could ever be measured so cleanly. They passed it without stopping, stepping forward with the quiet confidence of people who believed they would be back before dark. Most people do. As they walked, the forest opened and closed around them, light filtering through branches in shifting patterns. Conversation moved easily at first, touching on small things, work left behind for the day, plans for the coming weekend, the kind of talk that exists only to fill space and make the world feel companionable. The mountain listened without responding. It always does. The air smelled clean, sharp with resin and damp earth. Somewhere far off, water moved over stone, unseen but steady. These are the details people remember later, when memory begins to rearrange itself around loss. They remember the clarity of the air, the way the light fell, the absence of anything that felt wrong. It becomes important afterward to know that nothing felt wrong. They were not reckless. That detail matters. They checked their map. They stayed on the trail. Their boots were appropriate, their pack sensible. This was not a story that began with poor decisions or obvious mistakes. It began with trust in preparation, in experience, in the unspoken agreement between humans and places they returned to again and again. The mountain had never given them a reason to doubt it before. As the path climbed, the forest thinned, replaced by open stretches of rock and low brush. Wind moved more freely here, tugging at jackets, carrying sound away almost as soon as it was made. Voices grew quieter, not out of fear, but because effort demanded breath. Silence settled in naturally, the kind that feels companionable rather than heavy. The mountain was not empty. It was simply vast enough to make small sounds feel unnecessary. There is a moment on hikes like this when the world behind you seems to disappear. Cars, roads, obligations, they all fall away, replaced by the immediacy of footfalls and terrain. Time slows without asking permission. Hours are no longer measured by clocks, but by landmarks passed and elevation gained. It is a peaceful narrowing of focus, and it makes the idea of being lost feel impossible. How could you disappear in a place where every step is felt so clearly? The sun climbed higher, warming exposed skin, glinting off stone. Somewhere along the trail, one of them paused to take in the view, not dramatically, not as a marker of anything significant, just a natural reaction to beauty. Valleys stretched below, layered in greens and grays. The path ahead curved out of sight, promising more of the same. Nothing about the scene suggested finality. If there was a last ordinary moment, it did not announce itself. It rarely does. It might have been the adjustment of a strap, the comment about the incline ahead, the quiet agreement to stop for water after the next bend. These moments do not glow or slow down. They pass unnoticed, only becoming sacred in hindsight. Later, people would return to this beginning and search it for meaning. They would replay the morning again and again, looking for cracks in the surface, anything that might explain what followed. Was the weather forecast accurate? Did someone seem distracted? Did they say something that could now be interpreted as doubt? But the truth is simpler and harder to accept. The day began like countless others, and that sameness is what makes it unbearable. By midday, the trail held their footprints, temporary impressions already beginning to soften at the edges. The mountain does not preserve such things for long. Wind moves, stone shifts. The earth is always in motion, even when it appears still. Every step they took was already being erased behind them, though they had no reason to notice. What no one knew then, not them, not the families who would later wait by phones, not the mountain itself, was that this walk would refuse to conclude, that it would stretch forward not just into the afternoon, but into years, into decades, that this ordinary morning would become a fixed point in time, revisited endlessly by people searching for answers that the rain did not yet offer. At some point, the trail narrowed. At some point, the light shifted. At some point, they moved farther into mountain's interior, where paths intersect and decisions are made without ceremony. None of these moments announced themselves as thresholds. They were simply part of the forward motion of a hike that was supposed to end with tired legs, shared stories, and a drive home before nightfall. The mountain did not change its expression. It did not warn or signal. It remained what it had always been, ancient, vast, and indifferent to the scale of human plans. The day continued to unfold with quiet certainty, even as it edged closer to something that would break its shape forever. And somewhere along that path, in a place that would later be studied and mapped and argued over, the story slipped out of the realm of the ordinary, not with a sound loud enough to echo, not with a moment dramatic enough to mark time, but with a subtle shift so small it went unnoticed as it happened. The kind of shift that only becomes visible when you look back and realize the day never came to an end. Evening arrived on schedule, indifferent to the fact that something had already gone wrong. The sun dipped behind the ridge with the same slow confidence it always had, staining the sky with color that felt almost inappropriate in its beauty. Down in the valley, shadows stretched across the parking area where one car remained untouched, its presence beginning to feel louder than absence ever could. At first, no one panicked. Panic is not the natural response to a late return. Mountains distort time, and hikers misjudge distances all the time. Someone suggested they had taken a longer route. Someone else checked their watch and shrugged. The air was cooling fast, but the assumption was simple and comforting. They would appear soon, silhouettes cresting the trail, tired and apologetic for the delay. Minutes passed, then more. The light thinned, turning gold into gray. The trailhead grew quieter, the casual movement of other hikers fading as doors closed and engines started. Each departing car felt like a subtraction, narrowing the world down to a single, unresolved point. Still, no alarm was raised. Hope has a way of protecting itself in small increments. A phone was checked. No signal. That, too, felt normal. Another call was made anyway, just in case. It went unanswered, ringing into the empty space of the mountain. The sound seemed to vanish as soon as it began, swallowed by distance and rock. The silence that followed felt heavier than it had a few hours earlier, as if it had acquired weight. By the time the sun fully disappeared, concern had quietly replaced patience. The temperature dropped, bringing with it a different kind of urgency. Someone pulled on a jacket, less for warmth than for something to do with their hands. Questions began to form, still careful, still restrained. Had they said which route they were taking? How long was that trail supposed to be exactly? The mountain answered none of them. It stood dark now, its familiar contours reduced to a single looming shape against the night sky. Trails that felt manageable in daylight became abstract ideas after dark. Lines on a map, suggestions rather than paths. The realization crept in slowly. If they were still up there, the night had found them. Families were contacted not with fear, but with caution. They're running late, someone said, choosing words that would not travel too far ahead of themselves. Probably nothing. On the other end of the line, voices responded with understanding that masked the first stirrings of dread. Everyone wanted to believe in the most ordinary explanation possible. As hours passed, That belief began to strain. There's a moment when waiting shifts from passive to active, when the body recognizes that something is required of it. That moment arrived quietly, without announcement. A decision was made to call it in, not because disaster was assumed, but because the mountain no longer felt neutral. It had become a question. Search and rescue protocols moved into place with practiced efficiency. Names were written down, descriptions given, clothing colors recalled with sudden, desperate clarity. Each detail felt fragile, as if it might dissolve if not spoken quickly enough. The words "experienced hikers" were repeated more than once, as if experience itself might serve as protection. Lights cut through the darkness as vehicles arrived, their presence both reassuring and unsettling. Flashlights traced the first stretch of trail, beams bouncing off rocks and trees, creating illusions of movement where there was none. The forest at night is not hostile, but it is unfamiliar, its sounds amplified and rearranged. Every rustle demanded attention. The initial search was cautious, limited by darkness and safety. No one wanted to add to the number of people who needed to be found. Names were called into the trees, voices echoing briefly before fading. There was something almost ritualistic about it, the act of calling out into a space that did not answer back. Each unanswered call felt like a small erasure. Back home, lights stayed on longer than usual. Families sat in rooms that felt too quiet, replaying the day from the beginning. What time had they left? What had they been wearing? Had anyone mentioned a change in plans? These questions circled endlessly, never landing anywhere solid. Sleep, when it came at all, was shallow and easily broken. Midnight passed unnoticed. Time lost its shape, stretching and compressing in uncomfortable ways. On the mountain, search teams marked their limits and prepared to return at first light. The night was not the enemy, but it was an obstacle, one that demanded respect. The decision to pause felt wrong and necessary at the same time. The car remained where it had been left, a quiet anchor to a reality that no longer made sense. Its presence suggested intention and return, two things that were beginning to feel uncertain. Keys were still inside. Nothing had been disturbed. It was as if the day had simply stopped mid-sentence. By morning, the story had changed without anyone fully acknowledging it. The word "late" no longer fit. Neither did "lost." The language shifted toward something heavier, something that carried implications no one wanted to voice out loud. The mountain, washed in early light once again, looked unchanged. The trail appeared harmless, even inviting, betraying no sign of what it was now holding. When search efforts resumed at dawn, they did so with renewed urgency and a growing sense of disbelief. How could two people vanish so completely in a place so thoroughly walked, mapped, and loved? Each step taken by the searchers was measured against a memory of how ordinary the beginning had been. Down below, phones rang with updates that offer activity but not answers. We're expanding the search area. We're bringing in additional teams. These statements were meant to comfort, but they carried an unspoken truth. There was nothing yet to find. As the second day unfolded, the absence solidified into something real and immovable. It was no longer about a delayed hike or a missed turn. It was about a space where people should have been and were not. The mountain held that space without explanation, and the night before lingered like a hell breath that never fully released. By the time the sun climbed again, casting long shadows across the trailhead, it was clear that the day they had set out on was not finished. It had extended itself unnaturally, stretching into the present with a question that refused to settle. Somewhere between sunset and dawn, the story had crossed a line, moving from inconvenience into mystery, and no one yet knew how long it would remain there. Evening arrived on schedule, indifferent to the fact that something had already gone wrong. The sun dipped behind the ridge with the same slow confidence it always had, staining the sky with color that felt almost inappropriate in its beauty. Down in the valley, shadows stretched across the parking area where one car remained untouched, its presence beginning to feel louder than absence ever could. At first, no one panicked. Panic is not the natural response to a late return. Mountains distort time, and hikers misjudge distances all the time. Someone suggested they had taken a longer route. Someone else checked their watch and shrugged. The air was cooling fast, but the assumption was simple and comforting. They would appear soon, silhouettes cresting the trail, tired and apologetic for the delay. Minutes passed. Then more. The light thinned, turning gold into gray. The trailhead grew quieter, the casual movement of other hikers fading as doors closed and engines started. Each departing car felt like a subtraction, narrowing the world down to a single, unresolved point. Still, no alarm was raised. Hope has a way of protecting itself in small increments. A phone was checked. No signal. That, too, felt normal. Another call was made anyway, just in case. It went unanswered, ringing into the empty space of the mountain. The sound seemed to vanish as soon as it began, swallowed by distance and rock. The silence that followed felt heavier than it had a few hours earlier, as if it had acquired weight. By the time the sun fully disappeared, concern had quietly replaced patience. The temperature dropped, bringing with it a different kind of urgency. Someone pulled on a jacket, less for warmth than for something to do with their hands. Questions began to form, still careful, still restrained. Had they said which route they were taking? How long was that trail supposed to be exactly? The mountain answered none of them. It stood dark now, its familiar contours reduced to a single looming shape against the night sky. Trails that felt manageable in daylight became abstract ideas after dark. Lines on a map, suggestions rather than paths. The realization crept in slowly. If they were still up there, the night had found them. Families were contacted not with fear, but with caution. They're running late, someone said, choosing words that would not travel too far ahead of themselves. Probably nothing. On the other end of the line, voices responded with understanding that masked the first stirrings of dread. Everyone wanted to believe in the most ordinary explanation possible. As hours passed, that belief began to strain. There is a moment when waiting shifts from passive to active, when the body recognizes that something is required of it. That moment arrived quietly, without announcement. A decision was made to call in. Not because disaster was assumed, but because the mountain no longer felt neutral. It had become a question. Search and rescue protocols moved into place with practiced efficiency. Names were written down, descriptions given, clothing colors recalled with sudden, desperate clarity. Each detail felt fragile, as if it might dissolve if not spoken quickly enough. The words "experienced hikers" were repeated more than once, as if experience itself might serve as protection. Lights cut through the darkness as vehicles arrived, their presence both reassuring and unsettling. Flashlights traced the first stretch of trail, beams bouncing off rocks and trees, creating illusions of movement where there was none. The forest at night is not hostile, but it is unfamiliar, its sounds amplified and rearranged. Every rustle demanded attention. The initial search was cautious, limited by darkness and safety. No one wanted to add to the number of people who needed to be found. Names were called into the trees, voices echoing briefly before fading. There was something almost ritualistic about it, the act of calling out into a space that did not answer back. Each unanswered call felt like a small erasure. Back home, lights stayed on longer than usual. Families sat in rooms that felt too quiet, replaying the day from the beginning. What time had they left? What had they been wearing? Had anyone mentioned a change in plans? These questions circled endlessly, never landing anywhere solid. Sleep, when it came at all, was shallow and easily broken. Midnight passed unnoticed. Time lost its shape, stretching and compressing in uncomfortable ways. On the mountain, search teams marked their limits and prepared to return at first light. The night was not the enemy, but it was an obstacle, one that demanded respect. The decision to pause felt wrong and necessary at the same time. The car remained where it had been left, a quiet anchor to a reality that no longer made sense. Its presence suggested intention and return, two things that were beginning to feel uncertain. Keys were still inside. Nothing had been disturbed. It was as if the day had simply stopped mid-sentence. By morning, the story had changed without anyone fully acknowledging it. The word late no longer fit. Neither did loss. The language shifted toward something heavier, something that carried implications no one wanted to voice out loud. The mountain, washed in early light once again, looked unchanged. The trail appeared harmless, even inviting, betraying no sign of what it was now holding. When search efforts resumed at dawn, they did so with renewed urgency and a growing sense of disbelief. How could two people vanish so completely in a place so thoroughly walked, mapped, and loved? Each step taken by the searchers was measured against a memory of how ordinary the beginning had been. Down below, phones rang with updates that offer activity but not answers. We're expanding the search area. We're bringing in additional teams. These statements were meant to comfort, but they carried an unspoken truth. There was nothing yet to find. As the second day unfolded, the absence solidified into something real and immovable. It was no longer about a delayed hike or a missed turn. It was about a space where people should have been and were not. The mountain held that space without explanation, and the night before lingered like a hell breath that never fully released. By the time the sun climbed again, casting long shadows across the trailhead, it was clear that the day they had set out on was not finished. It had extended itself unnaturally, stretching into the present with a question that refused to settle. Somewhere between sunset and dawn, the story had crossed a line, moving from inconvenience into mystery, and no one yet knew how long it would remain there. When the search stopped producing answers, something else rushed in to take their place. Silence, left unchecked, rarely remains empty for long. It invites interpretation, speculation, and eventually judgment. In the absence of evidence, stories began to form, not carefully, not kindly, but inevitably. At first, they were small questions spoken in low voices. Why that trail? Why that day? Why no sign at all? These questions floated through conversations among searchers, journalists, and distant observers alike. They carried no accusation yet, only curiosity shaped by discomfort. People are uneasy with mysteries that resist explanation. They want cause and effect, something to point to, something that restores order. As days passed, the questions sharpened. The tone changed. News segments began to fill time not with updates, but with possibilities. Experts who had never met the hikers spoke about decision-making at altitude, about common mistakes, about how even experienced people can overestimate their abilities. The word experienced, once reassuring, was slowly reframed into something else. Confidence that bordered on arrogance, familiarity that bred carelessness. The mountain, once depicted as serene and majestic, became a backdrop for speculation. A place that had welcomed hikers for generations was suddenly described as deceptive, unforgiving, full of hidden dangers. It was easier to paint the terrain as malicious than to accept how quietly things could go wrong. But not all suspicions settled on the land. Attention turned, subtly at first, toward the people who had disappeared. Old photographs were displayed on screens, analyzed for clues they had never been meant to contain. Smiles were scrutinized, body language interpreted. Casual details from their lives were elevated into potential motives or warnings. A missed phone call, a recent argument, a vague comment someone half remembered from weeks before. None of it meant anything on its own, but meaning was assigned anyway. For the families, this shift felt like a second loss. They watched as the people they loved were slowly rewritten into characters in a narrative they did not recognize. Complexity was stripped away, replaced by theories that sounded convincing only because no one could disprove them. The absence of facts created space for imagination, and imagination rarely shows mercy. Some suggested the hikers had intentionally gone off-grid, seeking isolation or escape. Others hinted at secrets, personal struggles, hidden plans, things that might explain a voluntary disappearance. These ideas spread quietly, often framed as harmless curiosity, but they left deep impressions. Once spoken, they lingered, reshaping how strangers understood lives they had never known. The families pushed back when they could, correcting misinformation, clarifying timelines. But defending the truth felt like trying to hold water in their hands. Every denial seemed to generate another theory. Every statement was dissected for tone, for implication. Grief itself became suspect. Too calm, too emotional, too controlled, not enough, too much. In public, they learned to choose words carefully. Every sentence carried weight. Every interview felt like walking through a field of invisible traps. They spoke about who their loved ones were, not what they had become in the public imagination. They emphasized responsibility, preparation, normalcy. They repeated the same facts until those facts felt worn thin. Behind closed doors, frustration and anger surfaced. It was unbearable to watch strangers debate the worthiness of concern, as if disappearance were a puzzle meant for entertainment rather than a wound still bleeding. The mountain had taken something from them, but the speculation took something else: the privacy of grief, the dignity of memory. Meanwhile, the official narrative remained restrained. Authorities avoided conjecture, sticking to what could be confirmed. Their silence, though professional, was often misinterpreted. To some, it suggested withheld information. To others, incompetence. The gap between what was known and what was wanted widened, and suspicion filled it eagerly. Online forums and late-night discussions added fuel. Maps were shared, routes traced, mistakes imagined. Armchair experts argued over elevation profiles and weather patterns, each convinced they had uncovered the missing piece. The mountain was reduced to data points, stripped of context, as if numbers alone could account for its complexity. The hikers themselves were rarely spoken of as people anymore. They became subjects, cases, examples. Their disappearance was used to warn others, to illustrate danger, to justify fear. This transformation was subtle but profound. It shifted the focus away from loss and toward lesson, away from empathy and toward explanation. Yet for all the talk, nothing new emerged. No credible leads. No overlooked evidence. The mountain remained silent, unmoved by the narratives forming around it. The more people spoke, the clearer it became that language alone could not bridge the gap between speculation and truth. In quieter moments, away from cameras and comment sections, a different kind of suspicion took hold. One less accusatory, more existential. If two people could vanish so completely, what did that say about the limits of control? About preparation? About safety? These questions were harder to voice because they pointed not outward, but inward. It was easier to believe in a mistake, a secret, a choice gone wrong. Those explanations preserved the comforting illusion that such a thing could be avoided. Accepting that the mountain could simply absorb someone without warning or reason was far more unsettling. It suggested vulnerability on a scale few were willing to acknowledge. As weeks passed, interest waned as it always does. New stories replaced old ones. Speculation faded, leaving behind fragments, half-formed theories, unresolved arguments, a lingering sense of unease. For most people, the mystery became background noise, something remembered only when prompted. For the families, it never receded. The suspicions they had endured did not disappear with the cameras. They lingered in sideways glances, in unasked questions, in the subtle distance that sometimes follows tragedy. They learned that disappearance does not end when searching stops. It continues in how stories are told and retold. The mountain, still unchanged, held its position in the distance. It neither confirmed nor denied any of the narratives constructed around it. It simply remained vast and unknowable, refusing to be reduced to metaphor or morality. In the end, the silence did not accuse. People did, and that, perhaps, was one of the cruelest parts of waiting for answers that never came. Time did not move forward so much as it stretched, thinning into something fragile and uneven. Days passed, then weeks, but they did not behave the way days and weeks were supposed to. They did not stack neatly on top of one another or carry a sense of progress. Instead, they hovered, overlapping, each one carrying the same unanswered questions as the last. The official search had ended, but the waiting had not. It simply changed shape, where there had once been schedules and briefings. There was now silence broken only by occasional phone calls that never seemed to bring anything new. The word, suspended, lingered in the air, heavy with implication. It suggested intention without commitment, hope without momentum. At home, life attempted to resume its old patterns, but nothing fit quite right. Objects felt wrong in their familiarity. Shoes remained by the door, unworn. Jackets hung where they had always hung, still carrying the faint scent of cold air and pine. These details became anchors, proof that the past was real even as the present refused to make sense. Birthdays arrived without celebration. Holidays passed with rituals half observed, gestures made out of habit rather than joy. Conversations stumbled over absences that no one knew how to name. There was no language for someone who was neither gone nor present. No social script for a loss without an ending. People offered comfort when they could, often unsure what form it should take. They'll turn up, some said, clinging to optimism long after it had stopped feeling realistic. Others spoke in softer tones, their words carefully vague. Both approaches missed the point. What hurt most was not the fear of a specific outcome, but the suspension itself, the inability to move in any direction at all. Every ring of the phone carried potential. Every unfamiliar number sent a jolt through the body, a brief, electric surge of hope and dread intertwined. Most calls led nowhere. A wrong number. A reminder about something trivial. Each one left behind a residue of disappointment that had to be absorbed before the next could be answered. Sleep became unpredictable. Some nights were spent staring at the ceiling, the mind replaying every detail of the last known day. Other nights passed in exhausted oblivion, only to be followed by guilt for having rested at all. Dreams, when they came, were vivid and unsettling, filled with near misses and voices just out of reach. The mountain remained in the background. Its presence felt even from afar. Photos of it were avoided and sought out in equal measure. Maps were studied not with the urgency of a search, but with the quiet obsession of someone trying to understand a language they no longer trusted. Trails once seen as inviting now felt accusatory, as if they were withholding something intentionally. Seasons change, and with them the mountain's appearance. Snow covered high elevations, erasing the last traces of human movement. In spring, meltwater reshaped the land, carrying soil and stone downhill, rearranging the surface. Each change felt like a closing door. Whatever might have been visible before was now buried, transformed, or carried away. Public attention faded almost completely. Occasionally, an anniversary prompted a brief mention, a reminder that the story existed at all. These moments were strange, both comforting and painful. It was reassuring to know the disappearance had not been entirely forgotten, but jarring to see it reduced to a paragraph or a headline. Within the families, time took on a different rhythm. There were moments of fragile normalcy, shared meals, laughter that surprised everyone by arriving unannounced. These moments were often followed by guilt, as if joy were a betrayal of those still missing. Grief did not move in a straight line. It circled, returned, reshaped itself. Some days were defined by determination. Letters were written, officials contacted, requests made for renewed searches, for re-examinations of terrain, for anything that might break the stillness. Responses were polite and noncommittal, constrained by resources and probability. The mountain, after all, had already been searched. There was nothing more to find. That was the official position, and it was delivered with quiet finality. Other days were defined by exhaustion. The effort required to hold on to uncertainty began to outweigh the energy available. Acceptance hovered on the edges of consciousness, not as resolution, but as a way to survive. Accepting not an outcome, but the reality that answers might never come. Photographs were handled differently now. Once casual, they became artifacts. Each image was studied for signs of continuity, proof that the person existed beyond memory. Stories were told and retold, solidifying details that might otherwise fade. Memory became a responsibility, something to be maintained rather than assumed. The passing years blurred together, marked more by internal shifts than external events. Children grew older, jobs changed, new routines formed, and yet the disappearance remained a fixed point, unaltered by time. It resisted being absorbed into the past, insisting on its relevance in the present. The legal system eventually demanded its own kind of closure. Documents had to be filed, statuses reviewed. These processes were clinical, impersonal, and necessary. They forced choices that felt impossible. How to categorize someone whose fate was unknown, how to acknowledge absence without confirmation. Each step forward felt like a compromise, a concession to reality that did not feel earned. The mountain continued to exist, largely unremarked upon by those not personally connected to the story. New hikers walked its trails, unaware of the layers of waiting embedded in the landscape. They took photos, admired views, returned home. Life moved around the mystery, without touching it. For those who waited, The years stretched into another, then another. Hope did not vanish, but it evolved. It became quieter, less specific, no longer tied to rescue or return. It shifted towards something more abstract, a desire for understanding, for narrative, for the simple relief of knowing. In the absence of answers, people learned to live alongside uncertainty. They learned how to carry it into grocery stores, into conversations, into ordinary afternoons. It became part of the background, always present, rarely acknowledged, a weight that could be shifted but never set down. The waiting did not end. It simply became the condition of life itself, a long, unbroken year that repeated itself endlessly, marked not by dates on a calendar, but by the quiet persistence of unanswered questions. For decades, the mountain kept its silence. It watched seasons cycle through their familiar patterns, felt the slow pressure of snowpack and thaw, endured storms that reshaped its surface in ways too subtle for anyone to notice at the time. While human lives moved forward in fits and starts, the terrain continued its own long, patient work, governed by forces that paid no attention to anniversaries or unresolved grief. Then, without warning or intention, something shifted. It was not dramatic in the way people imagine revelations. There was no sudden crack that split the earth open, no sign that the mountain had decided to speak. Change arrived the way it always does in nature, incrementally, almost politely. A series of warmer winters loosened ice that held rock in place for generations. Heavy rains followed, saturating soil already weakened by time. Gravity, patient and relentless, did the rest. A section of slope that had appeared stable for years finally gave way. Stones loosened, then slid, carrying smaller debris with them in a slow, grinding movement that went unnoticed except by the mountain itself. When the dust settled, the landscape looked much the same as it always had. Familiar lines, familiar colors. Only someone who knew it intimately would have noticed what was different. Elsewhere, higher up, ice retreated. Glaciers that once pressed firmly against rock began to pull back, exposing ground that had not seen daylight in decades. What had been locked away beneath layers of frozen certainty emerged quietly, vulnerable to weather and time for the first time since the disappearance. These changes did not register as events. There were no news alerts, no officials called in to observe. To the world, the mountain remained what it had always been, a destination, a backdrop, a constant. But to those who understood how landscapes work, these subtle shifts meant something else. They meant that the mountain was no longer exactly the same as it had been during the search. Paths once inaccessible were now open. Places once hidden were exposed. Years later, a different group of hikers moved through the area, guided not by memory, but by curiosity. They followed routes shaped by erosion and retreat, unaware that the ground beneath their feet had only recently become part of the visible world. To them, the terrain felt ordinary, challenging in places, but nothing out of the ordinary for seasoned hikers. At first, nothing stood out. Rocks, dirt, sparse vegetation. The same textures and colors repeated over and over, creating a visual monotony broken only by the occasional shift in elevation. It was easy to fall into a rhythm, to let attention drift. Then something disrupted that rhythm. It was not immediately recognizable as significant, just a detail that did not quite fit, an angle that felt wrong, a shape that did not belong to mountain. In places like this, the eye learns to distinguish between what is natural and what is not, even when it cannot immediately explain the difference. They stopped more out of instinct than intention. The object was partially obscured, its surface dulled and altered by years of exposure. Sun and weather had stripped it of any obvious color. Time had made it blend, and almost too well. There was a moment of hesitation, the kind that comes when curiosity brushes against unease. No one wanted to jump to conclusions. Mountains are full of debris, remnants of countless human visits, lost gear, abandoned equipment, forgotten fragments of other stories. But this felt different. As they moved closer, the context shifted. What had seemed abstract began to resolve into something undeniably human, not in a way that provoked horror, but in a way that demanded attention. The mountain, after all these years, had altered itself just enough to allow something it had been holding come back into view. Authorities were contacted with careful restraint. No one wanted to overstate what had been found. The initial reports were cautious, measured, filled with qualifiers: possible, unconfirmed, under investigation. These words carried the weight of decades of uncertainty, even as they avoided promising anything definitive. When officials arrived, they did so with the understanding that this was not simply a discovery. It was a reopening. Procedures long dormant were revived. Maps from the original search were retrieved and compared against the present landscape. The changes were subtle but undeniable. What had once been unreachable was now exposed. The mountain did not yield everything at once. It never does. But what it revealed was enough to shift the story from speculation back toward reality. Enough to suggest that the disappearance had not been an abstraction, not a mystery suspended in theory, but an event grounded in a specific place, shaped by specific conditions. For the families, the news arrived softly, delivered in voices trained to be calm. There was no celebration in it, no sense of resolution, only a quiet recognition that something long buried, both physically and emotionally, had surfaced. The passage of time complicated everything. What might once have been clear was now altered, transformed by years of exposure and movement. The mountain had not preserved the past. It had carried it forward, reshaping it along the way. Any truth it offered now would be incomplete, filtered through decades of change. Still, there was something profound in the shift itself. For so long, the mountain had been seen as static, unyielding, a symbol of permanence against which human efforts had failed. Now it was clear that it had been moving all along, slowly rearranging itself, following rules that had nothing to do with human urgency. The revelation reframed the waiting years in a way no one had anticipated. The silence had not been refusal. It had been timing. The mountain had not withheld answers out of malice or indifference. It had simply required more time than anyone could reasonably endure. As word spread, the discovery was described as overdue, as if the truth had merely been delayed. But delay implies intention, and the mountain has none. What it offers on its own schedule, governed by erosion, thaw, and gravity rather than memory or guilt. The landscape, now subtly altered, stood as proof of that slow work. It was a reminder that truth, like terrain, can remain hidden not because it is deliberately concealed, but because the conditions are not yet right for it to be seen. And so, after decades of waiting, the mountain changed just enough to reveal what it had always been holding, not as an answer, but as an invitation to finally understand the question. The confirmation came quietly, without spectacle, as these things often do. There was no announcement meant for an audience, no dramatic language chosen for effect, just careful words, spoken slowly, weighed down by responsibility. What had been found was real. It belonged to the disappearance that had haunted so many years. The mountain had not revealed a story all at once, but it offered enough to make denial impossible. For those who received the news, the moment did not feel like an ending. It felt like a door opening into a room they had avoided imagining too clearly. Relief and dread arrived together, inseparable. After decades of not knowing, knowing itself felt foreign, almost intrusive. The human mind adapts to uncertainty in ways it does not easily undo. The sight was approached with restraint. Every movement was deliberate, respectful. Time had altered what remained, stripping away immediacy, softening edges. Nature had done what nature always does, absorbed, weathered, blended. What once had sharp lines now carried the muted palette of the mountain itself. Colors borrowed from stone, soil, and sky. Nothing about the discovery felt sensational. There were no clear boundaries between where the mountain ended and human presence began. That was part of what made it so unsettling. The terrain had not merely hidden what happened. It had incorporated it. Years of exposure had erased distinctions, turning memory into something almost geological. Investigators worked slowly, documenting without intrusion. They spoke in low voices, not because silence was required, but because it felt appropriate. This was not just evidence. It was a physical trace of a long-held absence, something that lived in imagination for so long that its reality felt unreal. The mountain seemed unchanged even now. Wind moved across the slope. Clouds passed overhead. From a distance, Nothing suggested that anything extraordinary had occurred. That contrast, the enormity of the moment set against the indifference of the landscape, was difficult to reconcile. When families were informed, the conversations unfolded in careful layers. There were pauses built into every sentence, spaces left for emotion to arrive on its own terms. No one rushed to fill them. There was no attempt to frame the discovery as closure, because everyone involved understood how inadequate that word could be. Some reacted with tears, others with silence. Some asked questions immediately, hungry for detail, for clarity, for something solid to hold on to. Others resisted information, overwhelmed by the sudden weight of reality after years of abstraction. Both responses were valid. Grief does not follow instructions. What the mountain gave back was partial, enough to confirm, not enough to explain everything. Time had taken its toll. Weather, movement, and decay had erased many of the specifics people longed for. The truth that emerged was not sharp or definitive. It was worn down, rounded by years of exposure. This incompleteness carried its own kind of pain. After so much waiting, it was tempting to expect answers that could finally settle the mind. Instead, the revelation brought a different realization, that some questions had simply aged out of existence. The mountain had not preserved the past intact. It had transformed it, and yet there was meaning in what remained. The disappearance was no longer an empty space. It was anchored to a place, to a reality that could be acknowledged and honored. The unknown had been narrowed, even if it could not be eliminated. For families, the mountain shifted from an abstract antagonist into something more complex. It was no longer just a site of loss, but also the source of truth, however delayed. This duality was difficult to hold. Gratitude and resentment coexisted uneasily, each one undercutting the other. The idea that the terrain had carried this truth for decades was both comforting and cruel. Comforting, because it meant the story had never been entirely erased. Cruel, because it highlighted how little control humans have over when answers arrive. The mountain had not responded to effort, to love, or to persistence. It had responded only to time. As details slowly emerged, the public narrative shifted once again. Speculation quieted, replaced by a subdued acknowledgement. The mystery that had once invited theories now demanded restraint. There was nothing to solve anymore, only something to accept. Media coverage was brief and careful. There were no sweeping conclusions, no dramatic reconstructions. The story resisted that kind of treatment. It did not lend itself to neat arcs or satisfying revelations. What had happened was both ordinary and devastating, shaped by circumstances rather than intent. For those closest to it, the days following the confirmation were disorienting. Routine felt impossible, yet necessary. There were arrangements to consider, decisions to make that had been postponed for decades. Each choice carried emotional weight far beyond its practical significance. The mountain remained present in all of it. Its image appeared in memories, in conversations, in the quiet moments when the mind wandered back to that place. It was impossible to separate what had been lost from where it had been lost. The terrain had become part of the story's emotional landscape. Visiting the site was not something everyone chose to do. For some, the idea was unbearable. For others, it felt essential, a way to bridge the gap between imagination and reality. Those who once spoke of a strange calm, an absence of the fear they had expected. The place did not feel hostile. It felt indifferent, vast, and ancient, just as it always had. Standing there, it became clear how easy it would have been to miss what had only recently come into view. How many times had people passed nearby, unaware of how close they were to an answer? The thought was unsettling, a reminder of how much the mountain had changed, and how much it had not. There was no moment of triumph in the discovery, no sense of victory over the unknown, only a quiet reckoning with the fact that the truth, when it finally arrived, was smaller and heavier than expected. It did not resolve the years of waiting. It reframed them. What the mountain gave back was not peace, but grounding. The story was no longer suspended entirely in possibility. It had weight now, a physical presence that could be acknowledged. That mattered more than anyone had anticipated. In the end, the revelation did not answer every question, nor did it erase the pain of the decades spent waiting. But it altered the shape of the grief, giving it edges where before there had only been fog. The mountain had not spoken loudly or clearly. It had whispered, just enough to remind everyone that truth does not always arrive when it is wanted, only when it can no longer remain hidden. With the discovery anchoring the disappearance to a real place, the focus shifted from wondering if something had happened to understanding how. This stage of the story did not unfold dramatically. There were no revelations that snapped into place or sudden insights that rewrote everything that came before. Instead, understanding emerged slowly, assembled from fragments, patterns, and probabilities. It required patience, the same patience the mountain itself had demanded all along. Investigators returned to old materials with new eyes. Maps from decades earlier were unfolded again, their edges frayed, their markings faded. Weather reports from that day were reviewed not as forecasts, but as historical documents. Wind speeds, temperature shifts, cloud cover, details that once seemed trivial now carried weight. Context mattered in a way it never had before. The terrain itself became the primary witness. What had once been a static backdrop was now understood as an active participant. Erosion patterns were studied. Rock movement was analyzed. Slopes were measured for stability. Angles recalculated based on how the land had shifted over time. The mountain had changed, but its underlying logic remained. It still followed the same rules it always had. Attention turned to the route they were most likely taking. Not the most dangerous one. Not the most dramatic. Just the one that made sense given their experience, their pace, and the time of day. Investigators avoided sensational explanations. There was no evidence of reckless detours or deliberate risk-taking. The path they followed was reasonable. That, in many ways, made everything harder to accept. Small details began to form a tentative sequence. A narrowing of the trail, where footing becomes less predictable. A section where loose rock overlays solid stone, creating a surface that appears stable until weight is applied at the wrong angle. These were not traps in any obvious sense. They were features hikers encounter every day without incident. But mountains do not require obvious danger to cause harm. They rely on accumulation, fatigue, distraction, changing light, subtle weather shifts. None of these things are remarkable on their own. Together, they can alter outcomes. Experts spoke carefully, choosing words that acknowledge uncertainty without exaggerating it. They explain how even experienced hikers can misjudge terrain, especially in areas where erosion has undercut what once felt secure. How a single misstep does not have to be dramatic to be consequential. How recovery, once balance is lost, can be impossible in places where the slope offers no forgiveness. The idea that emerged was not a catastrophe, but a sequence. One moment leading quietly into another. A slip, not a fall. A loss of footing, not a plunge. The mountain did not need spectacle. It only needed physics. The timing mattered too. Based on shadows, estimated pace, and remaining daylight, investigators believed the critical moments likely occurred later in the day, when fatigue had begun to dull reflexes, and light was shifting in ways that distort depth perception. The mountain looks different in late afternoon. Shadows stretch, edges soften, distance becomes harder to judge. This was not negligence. It was human limitation. There were discussions about weather changes that afternoon. Subtle increases in wind, temperature drops at elevation. Nothing severe enough to trigger alarms. Nothing that would have turned hikers back. Just enough to change conditions slightly, to make hands colder, muscles stiffer, concentration thinner. What emerged was a narrative almost painfully ordinary. No sudden storms. No equipment failure. No external threat. Just a convergence of factors that align in the wrong order at the wrong moment, in the wrong place. For families, this reconstruction carried a complicated weight. On one hand, it stripped away years of imagined horrors. There was no prolonged suffering suggested, no drawn-out ordeal. On the other hand, it removed the comfort of blaming something obvious. There was no villain here. Not the mountain, not the hikers, not fate in any recognizable form. The truth was smaller than the myths that had grown around it, and because it was smaller, it was harder to argue with. Investigators were careful not to overstate their conclusions. They spoke in terms of likelihood, not certainty. After so much time, absolutes were impossible. The mountain had altered the scene too much. Evidence had aged, shifted, blended into the land. What remained could suggest a path, not confirm it. Still, the reconstruction offered something the waiting years never had: coherence, a way to imagine the final hours without inventing unnecessary drama, a sequence that fit the terrain, the conditions, and the people involved. This was not a story of defiance or hubris. It was a story of how thin the margin can be between routine and tragedy, how places we trust can still demand more than we expect, how experience reduces risk but never eliminates it. For a long time, the absence of answers had allowed the imagination to run unchecked. People had filled the void with extremes, either assuming reckless behavior or imagining elaborate scenarios. The reconstruction brought everything back down to earth, grounded in the physical realities of the mountain itself. The terrain did not deceive them. It did not lure them somewhere unusual. It simply existed as it always had, governed by gravity and time. The mistake, if it could be called that, was believing that familiarity equated to control. As these findings were shared, reactions varied. Some found comfort in the simplicity of it. Others struggled with the lack of drama, as if tragedy required something more overt to feel justified. But nature does not operate on narrative satisfaction. It operates on consistency. The reconstruction also reframed the earlier search efforts. It became clear how easily critical areas could have been missed, not through incompetence, but because they were invisible at the time. What erosion later revealed had once been concealed. Search teams had walked past answers without knowing it, not because they failed, but because the mountain had not yet shifted enough to reveal what it held. This realization softened some of the anger that had lingered for years. Not all of it, but enough to allow understanding to take root. The search had not been inadequate. It had been limited by the terrain as it existed then. In revisiting the past, investigators did not just reconstruct the final hours. They reconstructed the limits of human perception. They showed how easily reality can slip through the gaps between intention and outcome. For the families, absorbing this version of events took time. It required letting go of certain questions that no longer applied. It meant accepting that the disappearance did not hinge on a single dramatic decision, but on a chain of ordinary moments that could not be undone once set in motion. This acceptance was not peace. It was adjustment. The mountain, unchanged by these discussions, continued to stand where it always had. It did not confirm or deny the reconstruction. It offered no validation beyond what the terrain itself suggested. Its silence was no longer hostile, just factual. In the end, the effort to understand the final hours did not close the story. It clarified its shape. It replaced endless speculation with quieter, heavier truth. That sometimes tragedy is not the result of bold mistakes or hidden dangers, but the simple reality that humans move through landscapes far older and less forgiving than they appear. And that understanding, however incomplete, was the closest anyone would come to knowing what happened when the mountain and two ordinary lives intersected at exactly the wrong moment. After decades of uncertainty, the truth, partial, weathered, and imperfect, settled into the lives of those who had waited. It did not resolve the past so much as rearrange it. The disappearance was no longer an open question drifting through time, but it was not a closed chapter either. It existed now as something defined yet incomplete, a shape with edges but no clear center. For families, the shift was disorienting. For so long, grief had been built around absence, around the endless loop of what-ifs and maybes. That absence had become familiar, even if it was unbearable. Now it was replaced by something else, knowledge that explained just enough to take imagination away, but not enough to offer peace. There were answers, but they were not satisfying ones. They did not explain why that moment unfolded the way it did, only how it likely happened. And even that explanation came with caveats, margins of error, acknowledgments of uncertainty. After so much waiting, the mind wanted finality. Instead, it was offered probability. This was the hardest adjustment of all. For years, hope had existed in the abstract. It had taken many forms: rescue, return, miracle, revelation. Even when those hopes faded, The act of hoping itself had been a kind of motion, a way of staying connected to the missing. Now hope had nowhere left to go. It could not move forward, and it could not return to what it had been. Some people felt relief simply in knowing where the story belonged. The mountain was no longer an imagined threat. It was a real place tied to real events. That grounding mattered. It allowed memory to settle, to attach itself to something tangible. But even that relief carried a cost. It made the loss permanent in a way uncertainty never fully had. Others struggled deeply with the incompleteness of it all. There were still questions that could not be answered. Why that specific spot? Why that exact moment? What were the last thoughts, the last words, the final awareness? These questions had not disappeared. They had simply become unaskable because no one could answer them anymore. Grief changed shape again, as it always does. It became quieter, but not lighter. It moved away from urgency and toward something more reflective, more internal. The sharp edges dulled, replaced by a steady ache that surfaced unexpectedly. In grocery stores, in passing conversations, in moments of calm that suddenly felt too quiet. There was also anger, though it no longer had a clear target. The mountain could not be blamed. It had done nothing unusual. Authorities had followed procedures. Search teams had worked tirelessly. No single decision or action could be isolated as the cause. Anger, without direction, turned inward or dissipated into exhaustion. The idea of almost knowing haunted many of them. The sense that they were standing just outside the full truth, close enough to feel its presence but never close enough to touch it. It was like hearing a voice through a wall. Clear enough to recognize, too muffled to understand. This proximity to understanding created its own kind of tension. The mind kept circling the same points. Try to squeeze more meaning out of the available facts. Maybe if one more map were studied. Maybe if one more detail were reconsidered. But there was nothing left to uncover. The mountain had given what it could, and time had taken the rest. Friends and acquaintances often assumed this phase would be easier. They spoke of closure, of moving on, of finally being able to rest. These words were well-intentioned, but they misunderstood the nature of the loss. Closure implies completion, and there was none here. What existed instead was containment, a way of holding the grief without letting it consume everything else. Life continued, as it always does, indifferent to individual timelines of healing. Responsibilities remained. Work demanded attention. Relationships required presence. The world did not pause to accommodate this new version of knowing. People learned once again to carry their grief quietly, to integrate it into daily routines. There were moments of clarity amid the heaviness. Moments when the understanding of what likely happened brought a strange sense of alignment. The story, once fragmented, now had continuity. It no longer felt like an interruption in reality, but a part of it. Tragic, yes, but coherent. That coherence mattered. It allowed memory to reorganize itself. Instead of replaying endless hypothetical outcomes, families could remember the people as they were before the disappearance, without constantly colliding with unanswered questions. The past became less distorted by uncertainty, even as the loss remained. Still, there were nights when the weight returned in full force, when knowing felt worse than not knowing, when imagination, stripped of its extremes, focused instead on small, intimate details, the feel of the air, the sound of footsteps on stone, the moment when balance was lost. These images, grounded in reality, could be more painful than any speculation had ever been. The mountain continued to exist in these thoughts, not as an enemy, but as a presence that could not be escaped. It had become a symbol not of danger, but of limits. Limits to preparation, limits to understanding, limits to how much control humans truly have. No matter how careful they are, some found meaning in this realization. They spoke of humility, of respect for nature, of acceptance. Others resisted it, unwilling to reduce a deeply personal loss to a philosophical lesson. Both responses were valid. Meaning is not something that can be assigned from the outside. As time passed, the story settled into a quieter place in public consciousness. It was no longer discussed widely, no longer debated or speculated about. But for those closest to it, it remained alive, not loudly, not constantly, but persistently. It was woven into who they had become. They learned that grief does not end when answers arrive. It simply changes its language. Instead of asking what happened, the question becomes, how do I live with this? And that question, unlike the others, has no final answer. There was a strange comfort in knowing that the mountain had not hidden the truth out of malice, that it had not swallowed the story whole. It had simply moved at its own pace, revealing what it could when conditions allowed. This understanding did not erase pain, but it softened some of the sharper edges. In the end, what remained was not resolution, but honesty. An honest account of how fragile certainty can be, how easily life can slip into tragedy without warning or intent. An honest recognition that even when the truth is found, it may not bring the peace we imagine. The weight of almost knowing became something they carried forward, not as a burden to be discarded, but as part of the landscape of their lives. Just as the mountain carried its own scars and shifts, invisible to most, but ever present to those who knew where to look. And in that shared reality of terrain and memory, of answers and absence, the story found its final unfinished shape. Today, the mountain looks much the same as it always has. From a distance, nothing about it suggests the weight of the story it carries. The ridgelines are steady, the valleys familiar, the trails worn smooth by years of footsteps that come and go without consequence. To most who arrive, it is simply a place, beautiful, challenging, inviting in its quiet way. Hikers still gather the trailhead in the early hours, adjusting straps, checking weather, talking about routes and turnaround times. Laughter carries briefly through the trees before dissolving into the larger sounds of wind and birds. Cars come and go. The rhythm of arrival and departure continues uninterrupted, as if the past never pressed itself into the soil beneath their feet. Some walk these paths without knowing the history at all. Others are aware of it only vaguely, having heard a version of the story stripped of detail and emotion. A name here, a date there, perhaps a small marker placed quietly off to the side. Most pass by without stopping, not out of disrespect, but because the mountain does not demand attention. It does not announce what it holds. The terrain has continued its slow transformation. Rock shifts almost imperceptibly. Vegetation creeps into places once bare. Snow covers and uncovers the ground with seasonal predictability. The land is alive in its own way, moving forward without pause, absorbing the past without erasing it. For those who know where to look, traces remain, not obvious, not dramatic, but present. A bend in the trail that feels different once you understand what happened there. A slope that commands more respect than it once did. These are not warnings carved into stone, but quiet reminders carried in memory rather than landscape. The mountain has not changed its relationship with people. It still offers beauty, challenge, and silence in equal measure. It does not punish or protect. It simply exists, operating on rules far older than any story attached to it. And yet, for some, walking these trails now carries a different weight. Each step is taken with greater awareness, each view framed by an understanding of how easily the ordinary can become irreversible. The mountain has become not a symbol of fear, but reality, a place where nature and human lives intersect without ceremony. The story is settled into the land, not as a scar, but as a layer. It does not dominate the present, but it is there, woven quietly into the fabric of the terrain. The mountain continues to stand, unchanged in silhouette, holding within it the knowledge that every path carries both promise and risk, and that not every story announces itself as it begins. What remained after everything else had settled was not a lesson, at least not in the way stories usually try to offer one. There was no clear moral to extract, no simple warning that could be neatly summarized and passed along. The truth, once revealed, did not arrive with instructions. It arrived quietly and stayed. For those who had carried the weight of waiting for most of their lives, the end of the mystery did not mark the end of grief. It marked a shift in how that grief was held. For years, loss had been suspended in motion, tethered to uncertainty. Now it had a fixed place, a physical reality that could be acknowledged. That acknowledgement mattered, even if it hurt. Memory changed once more. The years of speculation slowly lost their urgency, replaced by a deeper focus on who had been lost rather than how. Stories were told not to search for clues, but to preserve presence. Small details, laughs, habits, favorite phrases, rose to the surface again, no longer overshadowed by unanswered questions. The people at the center of the story began to feel whole again, not frozen in the moment they disappeared. There was a quiet dignity in that return. It allowed love to exist without constantly colliding with fear. It made room for remembrance that was not always heavy, not always painful. Sometimes, it even allowed for gratitude, for the years that had existed before the mountain ever entered the story at all. The truth itself remained restrained. It did not shout. It did not demand to be revisited over and over. It simply existed, solid and unmoving, like the terrain that had finally revealed it. In time, that solidity became a kind of anchor, something to return to when the mind began to wander into old habits of wondering. Not everyone experienced peace in the same way. Some never felt it at all. Acceptance for them was not a destination but a practice, something revisited daily, sometimes hourly. The absence never stopped being an absence. It only became more familiar, easier to recognize when it appeared in unexpected moments. The mountain, still present in the distance, no longer felt like an adversary. It was not forgiven, but it was understood. It had not acted with intent or cruelty. It had simply followed the same processes that shaped every landscape on Earth. That understanding did not erase the pain, but it softened the sharpest edges of anger. There was something humbling in realizing how small human timelines are compared to geological ones. Decades of waiting had felt endless, unbearable. To the mountain, they were barely a pause. This perspective did not diminish the loss, but it reframed it, placing it within a larger, quieter truth about time and impermanence. The story, once dominated by mystery, settled into something closer to reflection. It became less about disappearance and more about presence, about how people continue to exist in memory, in influence, in the subtle ways lives intersect long after they are gone. The ending was not haunting because it was unresolved, but because it was real. There was no dramatic closing image, no final revelation to tie everything together. Instead, there was continuity. The mountain remained. People continued to walk its trails. Life unfolded, indifferent but persistent. And within that continuity, the story found its place, not as an open wound, but as a scar that no longer demanded constant attention. What the truth ultimately offered was not closure, but honesty, an honest account of how fragile certainty can be, how quickly ordinary moments can slip into permanence, how even careful, experienced people move through a world that does not guarantee return. In that honesty, there was a strange kind of peace, not comforting, not gentle, but steady, the kind that allows grief to coexist with living, that makes room for both memory and motion, the kind that does not erase pain, but no longer lets it define everything. The mountain had revealed what it could. When it could, the rest was left to those who remained, to carry forward, to remember, to continue. And in that continuation, the story did not truly end. It simply became quieter, woven into the background of a landscape that would outlast it, holding the truth not as a secret anymore, but as part of its long, unbroken existence.